My name's Stephen Lacey. I'm the editor-in-chief of Green Tech Media. And for the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about frontier technologies and how they support the integration of EVs, grid flexibility, storage, and we'll talk about blockchain and the consumer. Let's throw another buzzword in there, the prosumer, because I think it's important to think about this from a consumer-centric focus. And I want to differentiate this conversation a little bit from the conversations that we had earlier this morning. So we heard a really good panel discussion on blockchain and distributed intelligence, and another good conversation on virtual power plants. And they largely focused on integration, and that's going to overlap with this panel discussion as well. But I also want to talk about the consumer-centric focus. How do you develop product roadmaps, think about integration, and also think about regulation that pushes us toward this consumer-centric grid. And when I say consumer-centric, I mean both for behind-the-meter systems and for large customers and utilities that are deploying front-of-meter systems. So the group up here has cumulatively a ton of experience in this area, working in some of the most innovative sectors in energy. And we're going to hear from them, again, how they're developing their businesses around this consumer focus and what it means for their future products and the future of how markets themselves operate. So going down the line here, we have Marco Teruzin, who is the Director of Energy Storage at E.ON. Hey, Marco. Maxine Gavi, who's the SVP of Market Development, Microgrids, and Grid Edge Technologies at ABB. Hey, Maxine. And Rick Kubin, who's the Vice President of the Clean Energy Blockchain Network. Thanks, you all, for being here. So we got a lot to get through in the next 30 minutes, and of course, please feel free to send in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Maxine, let's start with you. I'd just like to actually know how ABB thinks about the way it develops its products when you think about what consumers are asking for and when you imagine this consumer-centric world.
Sure, especially when we're looking at the behavior of the customers, consumers, prosumers, going from static to becoming very dynamic. It was already mentioned this morning, we certainly won't do it in isolation. We will ask questions because we actually work with utility service providers, et cetera, to really understand what are the challenges they're facing and what are their customers wanting to do. So first, it's really understanding the need, and both from a technical perspective, but also from a financial perspective, because the two really have to come together as part of a solution. And we clearly incorporate that into our product roadmap and work with our customers. But one of the things that we're seeing more and more when we talk about grid edge technologies is that not a single product can be developed in isolation. There's so many different touch points and connections that it has behind the meter to the other solutions behind the meter, but also all the way up the network, that we really look at the entire value chain. We look at all the stakeholders. We look at what are the key things that we actually need to worry about, what are the problems that we have to solve from a technical perspective, but also from the value add perspective, the value stacking in order for those products at the end to also create revenue stream. So the concept also of the minimum viable products that we have, it's really important these days to be agile. The market's moving very fast. There are very specific technologies that are coming on board. We have to look at the entire ecosystem. And then once we identify the solution, then we really have to work fast, and we have to work with our customers to actually co-develop some of these products and take them to markets. And markets vary. What we develop, for example, in the US may not be what's exactly is needed in Europe or elsewhere. So you also have to keep in mind the geographical differences and opportunities and challenges in mind.
You use the term value stacking, which I think is an economic way to describe technology integration. But really what it comes down to is that customers are trying to figure out how to pull a lot of these disparate distributed energy technologies together, and they're turning to you and asking, how do we create this broad suite of technology? So that must impact the way you think about product development as well.
It does, and I think companies like ABB are in a unique position. We certainly have all the specific products that we develop independently to address certain challenges or provide solutions from an independent perspective. But part of, for example, what my role is to look at across the entire portfolio of ABB, but also look at that from the perspective of the entire ecosystem in the market and again, the value chain, and look at how we can deliver solutions. The market is really moving towards providing solutions. This is what I hear more and more when I meet with customers is they don't want just a product in isolation anymore. They want to see a portfolio of solutions that have been optimized, that have worked together, and how can this come together to help enable certain opportunities for them, whether it be new business models or providing optimization or providing reliability. But all of that really comes together. So part of that, yes, that's value stacking, but it's also really realizing that we're not in the same ecosystem that we were in 5 years ago. And the stakeholders, what keeps them awake at night, those things are different than they were 5 years ago. So as a technology and solution provider, we've had to adapt and also think differently in order to be able to participate in this market with our customers.
Mm-hmm. Marco, how does thinking about the customer and the way that the customer uses energy storage influence your deployment and integration of storage at E.ON?
That is building on what Maxine was describing, the need to be agile. And this is a must now in every part of the value chain. And at E.ON, we are focused on a utility scale project. But what is interesting is to see how energy storage has accelerated the sales cycle within an industry that I was used to take multiple years to develop a project, like a solar or wind, studying the identification of the site, taking 2 years for the development, and maybe after 3 or 4 years engaging with the customer. Energy storage, it's changing this industry where we have to start to think in advance what the customer wants and who are the customer. The customers are changing as well because, for example, here in California, we know that probably 80% of the volume of energy that will be bought by 2022, 2023 will be bought by a new entity, the CCAs. So, this landscape is changing. And the CCA, as a new entity, they are also looking at the market with a need that is not very clearly spelled out. So we need to engage.
Yes. Anyway, sorry, continue.
No, but these, highlighted the level of uncertainty on the process that ultimately has to define what the customer wants. So there has always been in the utility scale business this difference between developing a project or developing product for end users. And I see that this distance is becoming smaller where even developer like E.ON, they have to start to think what the customer wants, how can we reduce the sales cycle, how can we reduce the time to develop a solution for the customer, and therefore we have to streamline our identification of a solution. And storage is pushing every stakeholder in the industry to get things done in a much shorter period of time.
So, Rick, you're obviously, I think, working on blockchain, the technology that is more closely associated with the prosumer and the rise of the grid interactive customer. People are very familiar with E.ON and ABB, but I'd actually like you to just explain what the Clean Energy Blockchain Network is first, and then we can talk about the broader themes.
Yeah, thanks. So Clean Energy Blockchain Network is a relatively new organization that was formed beginning of this year. And we are essentially the North American implementation and channel partners for PowerLedger. So PowerLedger is an Australian company that I would say is the leader in the energy blockchain space. And I think that's borne out by the number of implementations that they have. They did a very successful ICO last year, and we're getting a lot of really good traction. And but they were born out of trying to create a peer-to-peer trading capability, and so they've always been focused on the consumer, on the prosumer, and that's kind of really where the company started, was looking for a solution that would enable energy trading between entities, initially in the Australian market, where it's a little more relaxed, I would say, as far as the regulatory framework, and they've been very successful in doing that. So that's a little bit about PowerLedger, and then beginning of this year, they decided that they wanted to make a push out into a global market, and so they connected with us, and we've been working with them very closely on both providing input into their product and their roadmap, as well as the applications and potential projects that we can leverage, fully leverage their platform here in North America.
And one of those projects materialized. It was announced yesterday or 2 days ago here in California, tracking EV charging and then also low carbon fuel standard credits. Explain that project and how you're using the blockchain for tracking those transactions.
Yeah. We made the announcement. We're working with Silicon Valley Power, which is the utility entity for City of Santa Clara. And for folks who don't necessarily know what LCSF or low carbon fuel standard credits are, or system, something administered by the California Air Resources Board, and it's really a mechanism to promote clean fuels within the state of California. And by the flip side of that is to kind of penalize or disrupt the use of dirty fuels. So LCSF credits are generated and available to users of EVs, and then the credits are traded on a market, and companies like Shell or Chevron will purchase those credits to offset their dirty fuels. So the project is really quite interesting, and we've been in some discussions with California Air Resources Board, and they're going through some changes to their methodology and their program right now. And one of the things that they want to be able to do is support what they refer to as an enhanced credit, where if you can show that the fuel, in this case electricity, came from a renewable source, so PV, solar, that they would like to provide an enhanced or a credit enhancement. So you would get some percentage higher credit for that. So now the challenge is, how do you actually show kind of the chain of flow of fuel? So it turns out that Santa Clara has kind of a perfect little ecosystem to do this. They have a 6-story parking garage next to Levi's Stadium, and it has populated with solar on the roof. They have a battery storage system inside the building, and they have 48 level 2 chargers and 1 fast charge DC charger available to the public in the garage. So the project is basically a proof of concept to show how we can track the energy from PV into the EVs, and including storage as part of that mix. So that's part of it, is showing kind of that chain of custody. The other part is then looking to tokenize the LCSF credit. So it's something that we've proposed as an opportunity to California Air Resources Board, and they're interested in exploring what that might look like. And then by extension, it really lends itself well to the REC credit market as well. So being able to use the blockchain to show the creation of a credit from energy generation, and then wherever that credit gets retired, showing the whole kind of chain of custody and through a trading mechanism as well.
So a month or two ago, we had a two-part special on one of our podcasts, The Interchange, about how you would use blockchains and the blockchain in a bunch of different settings, and we looked at peer-to-peer transactions and tokenization and so forth, and we said, okay, we're not going to talk about this for a while until the utility makes a major investment or partnership, or there's a significant pilot, and here we are. We've seen this project and some others, so still really worth talking about. It's been interesting to see how quickly some of these pilots early pilots have popped up. So the dream of blockchain enthusiasts is to create this very secure peer-to-peer network of farm-to-table electrons, and it's this real pure consumer-centric vision for how the grid will operate. And I'm curious, from the E.ON and ABB perspective, how you think about that long-term vision for how the grid will operate. When you imagine, again, the products you're making or the business models that you pursue. I think blockchain gives us an interesting framing for this conversation, medium and long term.
I mean, blockchain is kind of a topic that has raised a lot of interest now, but it's not the only technology that currently, developer and a different stakeholder need to improve their profitability and eventually to expand use case and other applications. I think that there is a real advantage in the medium term to use a distributed ledger to track transaction, because the interactive energy, the exchange, the number of transactions will grow exponentially. At the same time, there is a strong need, if we use the example of energy storage, to improve the ability to understand how new asset that has been deployed in the last few years, like the battery, they operate, how they have to be designed to make sure that maintenance is not going to cost more than what was expected, and how to transfer all this knowledge to product that ultimately they can have they can find application directly with the consumer in the house. So machine learning, the ability to optimize design of product, the ability to reduce the design cycle, the timing, the time to market, it's something that currently the industry has to focus, I think, because this is a way to create competitive advantage. And blockchain, as one of the most interesting technologies that currently has been proposed, I think that will add additional pressure on to short the design cycle and ultimately to create more use cases.
I mean, from our perspective, just also build on that for a moment, just being technology agnostic, what's happening in terms of landscape is that consumers are wanting to maximize the value of the assets that they have. And they can do that in a number of things, and that also is putting a lot of pressure on the utilities, and that increases the participation and the engagement in terms of the discussions related to DERs. So there are different ways to maximize on those assets, and I think transactive energy is certainly one of them. We're seeing this happen. We're also looking at different technologies. Our ABB as a company is not, we don't do anything in blockchain ourselves, but as a solution provider, we need to ensure that we take that into account when we're building products and solutions, to ensure that if this is where the market is going, then we are able to help enable the technology and be able to participate in the transaction if need be. It's also a matter of how does everybody along the value chain will actually make money. At the end of the day, there are a lot of different technologies, and when you look at the value chain, everyone who participates at the end needs to get some incremental revenue from that. So I think part of that is still not clear. It's clear for the consumer. If the utility participates, it's possibly clear for them. It's clear for the suppliers of blockchain, but I think all of us collectively, in my view, haven't figured out how we all make money participating in all the different technologies, including transactive energy. But certainly, the market's going that way in that if the consumer wants to maximize their asset, this seems to be one of the easiest way to do it. And if the service providers want to ensure that they can continue to maintain their revenue streams, they have to participate somehow.
Rick, do you want to comment on that? Or,
So I would say one of the interesting things that's happening is kind of maybe a shift or even a redefinition of what a prosumer and consumer are within the market. And I think that I've been looking at some numbers. So in the U.S., 38% of the population are renters. And those are typically harder to support. There's a lot of churn within the rental market, and they're not as easy to justify putting in a long-term asset. I think that by looking at solutions that can support multi-tenant type buildings that include solar, include battery storage, include EV charging, those can be done in a way that become basically a win across all the constituents. So the building owner benefits from that. The tenants benefit from that. You can even put in behind the meter load serving devices where they can actually get PV power directly without even going through the utility infrastructure. So all these things are becoming possible now where they weren't just a few years ago. So I think the shift in what's accessible, both from a technology perspective, but I think also from a regulatory perspective, I think there's things that need to happen to help incent that.
yeah, and let's talk about that. That's one of the questions that was upvoted far more than others, and someone asked about time of use pricing or dynamic pricing to help many of these technologies, but I want to broaden even beyond those policies and just talk about regulation in general. I guess the question is this going to be a technology push that changes these markets or a regulatory pull? If you look at something like blockchain, the applications are vast and the technology is moving fairly quickly, but you're limited by the same regulations that impact every other technology. And so your use cases are very, very limited. I wonder how vital regulation is in thinking about this transactive grid. Do you want to start, Marco?
It definitely is essential, how regulation will evolve, over time. I use an example. FERC recently reshaped, or at least provided guidance on how the different ISO, they have to treat energy storage. And that is going to help tremendously the industry to expand the market, the potential market, so it will not be possibilities to deploy energy storage just in California or New York, but also in other markets. And that type of regulation is helping also to access additional data. And when you have data, you start to highlight better, to identify better what are the opportunities. So you have a technology push because that is inevitable. When somebody discovers a good technology, want to bring that to the market, and that is unstoppable. But at the same time, that is not enough to answer the question, as Maxine, you were saying. Everybody has to make some money. So, and when you get to that point, you need to have a real case that is backed by data. So regulation is essential to speed up or at least to drive the process.
Absolutely. Maxine?
Look, I think we're in a phase right now. Everything's moving so fast. There's a lot of new technologies that are coming up, and the utilities are having to deal with it. The regulatory framework has to deal with it. And I think we just need to change our approach. There needs to be a lot more three-way discussions. There needs to be a lot more discussions around the impact and the value and how fast they can be deployed. So I think trying to approach the steps in series as we've done in the past, it doesn't work anymore. Things are, just blockchain is a perfect example of how quickly it has evolved just in the last 2 years. So I think it's really important that we start having those three-way discussions with the utilities, with the regulatory framework, but also with the technology providers, and start helping connect the dots and provide the holistic view, but also go beyond that and really bring it down to reality and implementation and what impact it will have and what benefits it will provide to the consumers.
And Rick, I kind of singled you out in that question. How vital is evolving regulation for thinking about evolving use cases for blockchain?
It's it's really quite critical, and if you look, here in California, it was I think it's a kind of a pretty good use case in that. The California economy, if you take it by itself, is like the 6th largest in the world. California obviously has a lot invested in the systems that they have in place, but if you look at their objectives by 2025 and 2030 around carbon reduction, EV penetration, 1.5 million EVs by 2025 and potentially 5 million by 2030. And along with that, the whole reduction of carbon as a fuel. The only way that they're going to get there is by changing things faster than they have in the past. And it's not just CPUC and the CEC, it's also the IOUs and then the smaller utilities as well. But we've seen changes within CCAs, which are kind of gaining customer focus, but they're still tied to the utility infrastructure. So I think that if you look at some of the other markets, like Australia is an example where it has been largely deregulated and enables peer-to-peer trading. And blockchain is very well suited to support that. There's examples of how it works. The question is, how can you accelerate making some of these changes within a very traditional business space that generally has traditionally moved very slowly. But yeah, the pace of technology is accelerating, and I think the key is developing some proof points, some proof of concepts where you can prove the security, you can prove the reliability, you can prove the efficacy of the platforms.
Great. They're actually giving me a warning here and saying please wrap up. So we're going to have to call it at that. This is a really interesting conversation. We could spend another half hour going through these listener questions or these audience questions, and we will be answering a ton of these after the conference at GTM Squared and on our podcast. So any unanswered questions we're going to be trying to answer on the website as much as possible. I want to thank these three. We could go on for another hour here. Please join me in thanking them.